What do you say?
His name, synonymous with fraud.
Financial reports when investors began losing confidence and competitors closed in.
Hey, guys.
WorldCom may declare bankruptcy tonight. The company's board of directors has been meeting all day. It would be the biggest bankruptcy filing in history.
I simply do not know where the money is or why the accounts have not been reconciled to date.
With the collapse of FTX, the conviction of Elizabeth Holmes, and the widespread rejection of everything NFT all happening within the space of a month, financial fraud is once again big news, and it should be because it is costing you your financial future. This is not your imagination either. Incidents of identity theft, wire fraud, investment scams, pump and dumps, Ponzi schemes, phishing attacks, and sophisticated hacks are at all-time highs. Fraud cost Americans a total of $5.8 billion in 2021, and most trackers suggest that number will be even greater this year. These stories can be easy to ignore, because the victims of these crimes often had to, frankly, be pretty stupid and financially illiterate to get caught up in them.
I have to go make a call.
Anybody who has been anywhere near the internet in the last 20 years should know by now that you don't send money to Nigerian princes with Yahoo email accounts or corporate executives playing League of Legends during an investor meeting. It's all pretty common sense stuff, and you might then incorrectly assume that the rise in fraud is of no concern to you. When you really think about it, that $5.8 billion figure sounds bad, until you work out that's only $17.50 per American for an entire year. Not to flex too hard, but I have spent more on Starbucks coffee before. It's hard to see how such a small cost could be doing something as severe as costing young Americans their financial futures, but it is. So it's time to learn how money works to find out why you really need to start talking about stories about fraud personally, even if you never think that you would be dumb enough to fall victim to these schemes yourself. This week's lesson was sponsored by HelloFresh. HelloFresh has meals covered for you with a weekly selection of over 30 recipes and 70 convenience items, all delivered directly to your doorstep. Cooking has always been something I have enjoyed doing, but the stress of trying to get all the ingredients together without missing anything makes me scared to even start. Fortunately, HelloFresh is making cooking easy, saving me time on grocery shopping and streamlining cooking by providing a simple step-by-step instruction card. It's also 72% cheaper than going out to eat. When I got my box of meals, the first one I cooked was the zucchini and tomato flatbreads. As someone who doesn't cook often, I think I did a decent job, but go ahead and judge for yourself. And yes, it was as delicious as it looked. Knowing that the food is pre-portioned gives me comfort that my food waste is getting cut down by 25% compared to going grocery shopping. I love HelloFresh, and I know you will too. To get started, use the link in the description and use code HelloMoney and you will get 65% off plus free shipping for US customers, and international customers will get their very own special discount. Fraud is the wrongful or criminal deception of a person or institution to result in the financial or personal gain. With such a broad definition and so much money to be made, there's little wonder that fraud comes in all different shapes and sizes. There are the big-ticket frauds like Theranos, FTX, and Evolvis Ramasauskas' $100 million invoice scheme that took money from the likes of Google and Facebook over a period of 2 years by cleverly gaining access to their email servers. Then there are the less high-tech approaches like the IRS agent that needs you to pay your back taxes with iTunes gift cards. The emergence of new technologies cannot be overlooked in this trend as well. Fraud is at an all-time high, not in small part because technologies like the widespread adoption of the internet, online payments, sensitive file storage, and of course cryptocurrencies, which have all made this criminal behavior even more lucrative and much harder to trace. Fraud did exist before these technologies became mainstream, but to a certain extent, it required the fraudster to be there in person, which narrowed down their target audience and increased the risk of them being apprehended for their schemes. Today, there are a wider variety of schemes, scams, and frauds than ever before, which are targeting everybody from vulnerable elderly folk to the most sophisticated financiers in the world. The $5.8 billion that Americans lost to fraud in 2021 did not include money lost to some very important categories. The NFT market at its peak was worth around $17 billion according to Bloomberg and Dune Analytics. Since that peak, it has lost over 97% of its value and is now worth less than $500 million. A lot of unsophisticated investors got into this market because they were told by so-called experts that it was going to be the next big thing, and that monkey JPEGs were their surefire ticket to financial success. A lot of those experts benefited directly from getting suckers to buy into the NFT dream. Many of them used their positions to sell these assets directly, but because they didn't technically lie about any part of what they were selling, this loss is not counted towards the figures collected by the Federal Trade Commissions. Even people that orchestrated textbook pump and dump schemes using NFTs or cryptocurrencies have thus far mostly managed to avoid prosecution.
We got scams, we got pump and dumps. I don't go more than a couple of days without someone reaching out and telling me that they got cheated in one way or another.
The crypto market has destroyed more than $2 trillion worth of wealth in the last 12 months, and a lot of that is due to so-called investments being promoted in ways that would never be allowed if they were regulated securities like stocks or bonds. If these instances of fraudulent activity were included in the total, it would add up to be hundreds of dollars per American. Of course, this financial burden is not shared equally. There are people that have lost their entire life savings to frauds like this, and then there are people who thought that after reading stories about the 15th shitcoin rug pull in a row, that maybe a 401k was a better vehicle to securing a financial future. But unfortunately for this person, and all of you who are watching and feeling smug at the expense of people who got suckered into these schemes, we are all paying the price for fraud. The $5.8 billion reported by the FTC only includes verifiable and enforceable cases of fraud that have actually been reported to them. More has been lost to fraudulent activity that falls outside their narrow definition, and much more even still just goes unreported because people would rather not say that they got tricked out of their money. But an even larger cost is borne by everybody in the form of additional checks and balances that need to be put in place to avoid fraud in the first place. If you have ever wondered why it costs so much to send money overseas or why loan applications take weeks to process, it's because of fraud. A large share of the premiums you pay on your insurance and the hoops you need to jump through to get a rental are because of fraud. Financial institutions are required by law to have systems in place to protect their customers from fraud, and that means that they need to treat every interaction they have with you as if you are either a fraudster or a potential victim of fraud. The Government Accountability Office found that American banks were spending between 0.4 and 2.4% of their total operating expenses on anti-money laundering and bank secrecy compliance every year. Every new account costs a bank an average of $15, which might not sound like much, but it adds up quickly with some institutions managing over 100 million accounts. Fees are not the only problem expense either. Banks have been fined hundreds of millions of dollars for facilitating fraud, and in order to try to avoid fines and the reputational damage they do, most institutions hire large teams to constantly monitor all of their customers for anything suspicious. Due diligence like this is designated to stamp out fraud, amongst other criminal activities, but the costs are eventually passed along to consumers. There is little doubt that high-profile cases like FTX will be used by regulators as an example of why this kind of oversight is necessary in an industry that has prided itself for being totally decentralized and therefore impossible to regulate. Every check and balance regulated institutions are forced to do was the result of some type of fraud that regulators want to avoid in the future. I don't make it a habit to defend multinational banks, but one of the biggest complaints people have with them is being charged to simply have an account with them even if it has no money in it. In truth, most banks would probably love to be able to offer free accounts to everybody, but the compliance cost of those accounts means that it's not commercially viable unless they know they can cross-sell a revenue-generating product or charge you an account-keeping fee. Fraud is responsible for a lot more than just some pesky fees, though. As a part of a study, banks reported to the GAO that they had restricted access to high-risk products in an effort to reduce their exposure to fraudulent activities and the regulatory expenses that came with it. These so-called high-risk financial products were things like equipment loans, business lending facilities, and securitized investment lending. That might not sound that important, but these were typically the sources of funding that people would turn to when they wanted to start a new business. If people can't raise the money they need to get a business going, then they will personally miss out on the opportunity to build a vehicle for wealth generation, but also miss out on providing opportunities to potential suppliers, customers, and employees. The costs that we all indirectly bear become particularly disappointing when you learn about how effective these measures are. Know your customer, anti-money laundering, and bank privacy regulations were instrumental in the prosecution of less than 100 individuals in 2020, and of those, many were not caught by these checks, but rather charged for wire fraud or money laundering as an addition that prosecutors could add to crimes that these people were already being charged for. The cost of lending limitations due to fraud is impossible to put an exact number on, but it would be a lot, and it creates a regulatory environment where the only people worth doing business with are those that already have lots of money. You might think that blaming the landscape of modern banking exclusively on fraud is a bit of a stretch, so let's look at a more direct way that fraud has cost you your financial future: student debt. It's no secret that student debt has ballooned in the past 2 decades, but did you know that fraud played an important role in making sure that people start their careers with larger debt than their parents had to take on to buy a house? Before 1979, student loans could be discharged with bankruptcy like any other personal debt. But people were taking advantage of this by getting advanced degrees and then filing for bankruptcy as soon as they left college. There are downsides to bankruptcy, but for many young students, it was a small burden compared to the debt that they would have otherwise had to pay. To close this loophole, Congress passed Section 523 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, which made it extremely difficult to discharge student loans, both public and private, for any reason bar extreme hardship like a debilitating or terminal illness. The law has been updated 5 times since then, most recently in the year 2005, where amendments were made to expand the classifications of student debt, and even extend it to students who fall outside of the conditions of their scholarships, which can have that grant turned into a debt that they are liable for. This legislation was a boon for the education industry, because they now had the ultimate form of secured debt, so they took on very little risk when they started writing loans to anybody, regardless of their career prospects and ability to repay. The explosion of new student loans drove up the price of tuition, which means now it is next to impossible to get a degree without wealthy parents, a scholarship, or a big loan. What started as a perfectly reasonable way to remove a loophole that a small handful of people were taking advantage of by fraudulently claiming bankruptcy has turned into a multi-trillion-dollar industry, which is costing many young men and women their financial future. It's easy to laugh at crypto bros losing money on investments, gambling, that in hindsight were totally stupid. It's also easy to think that you would ever be dumb enough to fall for the run-of-the-mill scams that pop up in your email inbox and YouTube comment section. But just remember, our systems are built around being idiot-proof. And that comes at your expense when you can't get a loan, open a business, or get an education without accepting an inescapable debt. But hey, maybe that college degree isn't worth the money anyway. And to prove this point, you should go and watch my video that looks at some better ways to invest your time and money instead of going to college. A special thank you again to HelloFresh for making it possible for everybody to keep on learning how money works.
I think you were scammed.
Yes, 100% agree.